It's hard to believe that it has been about a year already after the Motor Vessel Dali slammed into the bridge support pier of the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, Maryland on March 26, 2024. But people still ask me all of the time, what happened to the Motor Vessel Dali? What's its current status? Are they going to rebuild the Francis Scott Key Bridge? It almost seems like a lifetime ago, really. First, the bridge came down, and then they spent a month and a half salvaging victims and debris, and then blowing the remaining bridge truss off of the Dali so that they could refloat it.
Hello. Look who's here.
Dali. This is Louis.
Hello, Louis.
Dali.
This was a great sight to see.
So nice to have you back where you belong.
I'm so glad to be back.
There she is pulling up dockside.
You're looking swell.
Thank you, Louis.
Dali. I can tell.
Does it show?
Dali.
Yeah, so inquiring minds want to know, and I've been getting a lot of comments about this. So today we're going to update 3 things here. We're going to talk about the Motor Vessel Dali since it left Baltimore, where it's gone and what it's doing now. And we're also going to talk about something that came up a couple of days ago. The NTSB had a media briefing and gave up some urgent recommendations that affect many other similar bridges right now. Some pretty unnerving stuff in there. We're going to talk about that. And then we're also going to talk about the new Francis Scott Key Bridge. Yes, there is going to be a bridge, and they are rebuilding it. And we're going to talk about the design and what's going on right now. Now, as you might recall, the last time most of us saw Dali was on June 24th, 2024, as you can see here, when the Motor Vessel Dali was being towed out of the port of Baltimore. And it was going to sail down to the port of Norfolk, Virginia, where it was going to be put under dry dock for some repairs before eventually limping its way to China for a complete rebuild of the damaged section. Right back into the middle of the channel where it all began, where she crashed into that left side bridge pier that was supporting the bridge to begin with. See, it's just about there now. That tugboat that's pulling it, look right above it, and you'll see the remnants of that bridge pier just sticking up out of the water. And then a few hours later, Dali approached the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. So here's the footage that was captured by Washington, D.C.'s Fox 5 channel from their helicopter. And look at this, another beautiful sunny day out there. And here it is. I sped it up for you as it made it perfectly under the bridge there without incident. So then the Dali ship, while it was sitting there in dry dock in Norfolk, Virginia, had many of the containers removed, and it was getting prepared to be moved to China. And when it left for China in September of 2024. So here you can see it on September 19th, 2024, after it was leaving the port of Norfolk there, and it was heading over to China. And I hope I pronounced this right, because it was heading to a shipyard called Fujian Huadong, and it's in the Luoyang Bay port area near what they call Fuzhou, China. And I hope I pronounced all of that right. Forgive me if I got it wrong. But that's where it went to in November, and it arrived there on November 13th, 2024. And Dali looked much emptier than it did 3 months ago with a bridge sitting on top of it. Holy cow, what a difference a few months makes, huh? So there it is. There's some close-ups of some of the damage there without the bow covered. You remember the last time we saw it, it had the bow covered. So you can see how twisted and mangled everything is. And man, does it look like a completely different ship without all of those containers. And look at all the damage on the deck. And there she goes. I mean, she's rusting and everything. And this is the shipyard where Dali ended up here in China. And as you can see, this shipyard can handle some very, very lengthy ships that are in for repairs. Now I'll show you where this is in China. So as we zoom out here a little bit more, you can see it's right off of Taiwan over here. And then, of course, Hong Kong and Macau, the gambling meccas are right over here. So this gives you a general idea of where it was at. It was in the southeastern part of China. But they pretty much very impressively got the repairs done on Dali in about 2 months. So here you can see on January 12th, 2025, it departed the Fuzhou shipyard to go ahead and begin its sea trials. So pretty impressive that they got it done that quick. This video was provided by the Synergy Marine Group, who manages the Dali, and they're based in Singapore. Now I added this list here for you that you see on the screen that shows you the 4 ports that the Motor Vessel Dali had gone to here during these sea trials that took place over about a week or so in late January. And then from there, she was off to the races. She immediately headed over to South America, to Chile. So the Motor Vessel Dali has been all over this planet from one end to the other in just a 6-month span. Now, of course, we know that the insurers settled for $102 million last fall with the federal government. And I'm sure there's still a lot of people now that are suffering that are never going to see a penny from this. So, I think that Dali should set aside like maybe 5% of their earnings for the foreseeable future until such time that they can pay back all of these victims, like pay into some kind of a super fund or something, in perpetuity even, or whatever, until everybody has been satisfied. I think that would be the fair thing to do. But of course, thanks to the Jones Act, it's so unfair, really, for any of the victims of any type of ship hazards.
Specifically, we're urging 30 owners of 68 bridges in 19 states to perform a vulnerability assessment of their bridge's risk of catastrophic collapse from a vessel collision, determine whether they need to implement countermeasures to reduce vulnerability, report their findings to the NTSB, and if warranted, implement a comprehensive risk reduction plan that includes, at a minimum, short and long-term strategies to reduce the probability of a bridge collapse from a vessel collision.
So Chairman Homendy here is firing a missile across the bow of all of these older bridge owners, these older famous bridges that were built before 1991, because they're not adhering to the ASHTO recommendations, a vulnerability assessment of your bridge in case it gets hit by a ship. The problem is look, we're getting more and more collisions between ships and bridges all the time. And guess what, folks? Ships used to be like this, and they're not getting any smaller. They're getting bigger and bigger like this now. So you're going to see more collisions and more damage and more likely a chance of a bridge get taken out. So this was an urgent message being sent out to all of these bridge owners.
State of Maryland was on ASHTO's executive committee at the time and served on ASHTO's highway subcommittee on bridges and structures, which developed those standards in 1991 and revised them in 2009.
Here's a screenshot I got here for you that shows you the 2009 edition that she was referring to. And I showed you the previous one, the 1991 version, that the state of Maryland served on.
Included in the 1991 standards was a recommendation from ASHTO that all bridge owners conduct a vulnerability assessment of existing bridges to evaluate the risk of catastrophic collapse in the event of a vessel collision and take action. All remaining existing bridges over navigable waterways with commercial barge and ship traffic should be evaluated using a vulnerability assessment in accordance with risk analysis procedures contained in this guide. The Maryland Transportation Authority never ran the calculation on the Key Bridge, and as of October 2024, they still haven't on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. Had they ran the calculation on the Francis Scott Key Bridge, the MDTA would have been aware that the bridge was almost 30 times greater than the risk threshold ASHTO sets for critical essential bridges. 30 times greater. What's frustrating is not only did MDTA fail to conduct the vulnerability assessment on the Key Bridge, they did not provide, nor were they able to provide, the NTSB with the data needed to conduct the assessment. We asked them for that data. They didn't have it. We had to develop that data ourselves.
Now here's an email that I dug up from the docket, and it shows where the NTSB had requested all of that information from the Maryland Department of Transportation, and their response was that they did not have it. That was some pretty scathing criticism there of the Maryland Department of Transportation, and that puts a lot of blame on their shoulders. So with all of those engineers there, and I know they're busy, they all have jobs to do, but it's like, so I'm like, okay, what do you guys do all day long there then?
What would you say you do here?
Well, look, I already told you. I deal with the damn customers so the engineers don't have to.
Okay, so what NTSB Chair Homedy was referring to here is this guide. So this is the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, otherwise known as ASHTO. That's what we call it in the engineering world. And so they have these rules and regulations on what you need to do when you're designing bridges. And so this right here is a guide, specification, and commentary for vessel collision design of highway bridges. So this is the one that came out in 1991. There's a later one that came out in 2009 that was updated. I didn't spend the $162 on it because you do have to buy the download to get it. So this is just an older version I saw online here. But at least in the 1991 version, if you come down to page 25, this is where it shows them how they're supposed to do this methodology to determine if there is a risk of a bridge collapsing from a vessel collision. It's called Method 2. This is the number you're after right here, 4.8.3, this annual frequency of collapse, so AF. So this is what the NTSB said that the other bridges were 30 times this amount. So this AF right here, let me just show you what the definition of it is. It's the annual frequency of bridge element collapse due to vessel collision. Now, what this sort of means, this is sort of a prediction of how often you're likely to have a collapse when the boat collides into your bridge there, like we saw with the MV Dali when it crashed into the Francis Scott Key Bridge. So it would have fallen under this calculation, and had they run the calculation, they would have seen ahead of time that this was going to happen. So this is similar to if you've ever bought a disk drive before, and you look at the sticker on your disk drive on your computer, and it'll say something like MDTA, that's mean time between failures. That's sort of a gauge of how reliable your disk drive is and how often they expect a failure mode to set in. So it's similar to that. They give the formula for how to calculate this annual frequency here. And here's all the inputs you're supposed to give it here. See, the annual number of vessels classified by type, size, loading, probability of vessel aberrancy, geometric probabilities of a collision. There's all sorts of parameters and stuff that you figure out, but they give you all the formulas and everything that they need. And so this is exactly what the NTSB Chair Jennifer Homedy was telling us, that the Maryland Department of Transportation, they never ran these tests on the Francis Scott Key Bridge. And not only did they not run the test, they didn't even have any of the data to give to the NTSB to run these tests, so they had to run their own tests. They had to run the calculations for them. So you're likely to see this in a lot of states because, look, this came out of nowhere. This caught everybody by surprise because when the Panama Canal increased in size in 2016, suddenly now you're getting, pun intended, boatloads of newer ships that are much, much larger than the ships of old, than the ships that we had, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So all of these owners of these bridges need to come in and rerun these calculations based on all the new traffic and all of the new boat sizes. So all of the owners of these bridges need to rerun all of these numbers based on all of the new ship traffic that they're getting there and the size of these behemoth container ships. Some of them can contain like almost 30,000 containers when the average used to be really, really small, just a few thousand. You can see right here on March 18th, 2025, the NTSB held this press conference and gave out urgent recommendations for right here. Here it says, the title says it all: safeguarding bridges from vessel strikes, the need for vulnerability assessment and risk reduction strategies. So basically what she's saying is they're identifying these bridge owners who didn't adhere to the ASHTO specifications and didn't come in and run these in this annual frequency of collapse numbers here. So in their marine investigation report to date, this is not the final report, by the way, on the MV Dali collision with the Francis Scott Key Bridge that you see here. But here's the 4 piers, and here's the protection dolphins that they had put in. And they're, as you can see, I always thought that just looking at the pictures, they look too small and they look inadequate for protecting the bridge. And of course, the fendering system didn't do so well either, because remember, with some of these bigger behemoth ships now, the bow can extend way out beyond the bottom of the hull where it meets the water, right? And so you can have these big overhangs that can still come in and destroy a pier. And in fact, here is the overhead view that they showed. Remember when the Dali had crashed into the pier right here, Pier 17? And if you look where the Dolphin is. It's 489 feet away from it, and it didn't even stop the ship because the ship never even hit it. So it was useless. There wasn't enough in place to stop Dali from crashing into Pier 17 right here. And then here's the Fort McHenry Channel, the one that's carved 50 feet deep here, right in the middle of the Potomac River in the channel. So in this case, it looks like that MV Dali had pretty much threaded the eye of the needle and scooted right by Dolphin number 1 to hit that pier. Many people might not be aware that in 1980, this ship right here, the Blue Nagoya, had crashed also into Pier 17 at the Francis Scott Key Bridge. But look at the size of the ship here from 1980 compared to the Motor Vessel Dali right here, what we have today with today's behemoths. And guess what, folks? Dali is not even one of the biggest ships that are out there. There's plenty of more ships that are much bigger than even Dali. But look, here's the length of the ship from 1980. It was 390 feet compared to the Motor Vessel Dali right here, which is 984 feet. And just looking at the Fort McHenry Channel, look how much space the Blue Nagoya takes up here compared to the Dali. It's like, man, it's almost like just being on a dinghy. Now, the NTSB's report kind of just repeats what I was just mentioning to you a minute ago. So you have the ASHTO Method 2 vulnerability assessment calculation is used to determine the annual frequency of collapse, AF. And these are all of the inputs that go into all of those equations here, see? That's what the individual bridge owners want to do, is take a look at all of this and generate those risk assessments based on these equations. See, and then a key point that they pointed out here is that bridges built before 1991 were not required to undergo this vulnerability assessment. And so, of course, Key Bridge, being built in 1977, didn't have it. Now, this is in the ASHTO specification here. It says the acceptable annual frequency of collapse, AF, of critical bridges shall be equal to or less than 0.01 in 100 years. This means we are looking for an AF equal to 0.0001 or less. So that's all we have to do, is make sure it comes in below that. So the NTSB published this week the data that they calculated for the Key Bridge under these different piers. So Pier 16, 17, 18, and 19, those 4 piers. Here's the problem. Your total right here at Pier 17 and Pier 18 is 0.001430 and then 0.001442. And remember, this right here is supposed to be 0.0001. So that's what they were talking about. Now, if you were just some pencil pusher looking at this chart of these numbers, you wouldn't even see anything pop out. But you have to know that this number right here is way, way above by many, many magnitudes of what it should be. That's the alarming part. They should have put this in bold and red, these 2 numbers right here, this one up here as well. Yeah, and so that's where they're saying right here that the NTSB determined that if MDTA had calculated the AF for the bridge before the collapse, it would have identified that the bridge's risk level was almost 30 times greater than the ASHTO risk threshold of 0.0001. That's what I just showed you on the spec a minute ago. So it says here, therefore, the NTSB concludes that had MDTA conducted a vulnerability assessment, they would have been aware that this critical essential bridge was above the ASHTO threshold of risk for catastrophic collapse from a vessel collision when the Dali occurred. So what the NTSB is saying here now is that the Maryland Department of Transportation should have known that the Francis Scott Key Bridge had an issue, that it was at risk and that it was overdue for a collapse, actually, statistically speaking, and that they should have been able to do something about this. This is part of the reason why we're in this position today. Okay, so these were the 3 takeaway findings that the NTSB summarized for us. Had the MDTA conducted the assessment, they would have been aware that this bridge was above the threshold. The other one here, too, is had the MDTA conducted the assessment using the Method 2 vulnerability assessment calculation, they would have had information to proactively identify strategies to reduce the risk of a collapse and loss of lives associated with a vessel collision with the bridge. And then here's the third finding, which encompasses many of the other bridges that we're talking about here. The 30 owners of 68 bridges over navigable waterways frequented by ocean-going vessels are likely unaware of their bridge's risk of catastrophic collapse from a vessel collision and the potential need to implement countermeasures to reduce the bridge's vulnerability. And then even in the appendices of the report, they pretty much duplicated that same formula here that I showed you from the ASHTO guide. So here it is inputting all of these other parameters here to arrive at your AF. Yeah, see, so the NTSB showed us this chart right here that shows the progression of how the early container ships were back in the 50s. This is their size here. And then here's around 1970. Here's in the 1980s. And then here's in the later 80s and into 2000 and deep into the 2000s here. Look how they're getting much larger, and look at the number of bays and how many containers they can store. I mean, look, way back in the 50s, it was nothing. Now you can fit thousands of them in there. And look at this. The MV Dali falls under this category right here, the new Panamax. And as big as the MV Dali ship was, folks, guess what? There's still classes 2 more up. And I thought I heard that there was another class that they've come out with even beyond this one here. I have to find out, dig more into that. But so this kind of gives you an idea for just how big. And remember, mass times velocity, that's your momentum. M1v1 equals M2v2. Remember that formula from physics? I remember going through that formula when I was a senior in high school even. And so a big boat like these up here are going to pack a lot of momentum when they crash into a pier. And this is why, in my opinion, the best way to stop a behemoth like that is forget about trying to bolster up the piers themselves. I think it's going to tear through no matter what. You got to stop the boat from ever getting to the pier, either with massive dolphins or you create a big beachhead around it so that if the boat's going to come in, it's going to hit the beachhead instead. Kind of like those trucks that go up those runaway ramps, like in Colorado, when you're going out skiing, you'll see these trucks. Sometimes they'll run out of control and they'll go up a runaway ramp, which is basically a bunch of rocks that help slow it down. Also, they could form the seabed underneath the bridge, right? And you could form it so that the ship would just sort of beach itself underwater even without having to build a whole bunch of rocks up on top as well. Okay, so let's take a look at this list that the NTSB put in the appendix. So these are 68 sort of well-known bridges that have not been assessed and need to be assessed to determine if there's anything wrong. So that's why they have the classification on here as either typical or critical and essential. And so here's a bunch here in California. And of course, one of the first bridges I noticed right here was, oh no, the Golden Gate Bridge. I'm like, oh no, man, that's my favorite bridge in the whole wide world. Well, I got a great picture of the Golden Gate Bridge. One of the best photographs I've ever taken was of the Golden Gate Bridge back in 1997. So you're looking at it right here. And I shot it with my Hasselblad camera that had a giant 2¼ inch slide film. So that had to be converted to photograph. But this is a beautiful shot right here. So the Golden Gate Bridge has always been one of my favorite marvels of modern engineering and architecture. But anyway, here's some of the other ones. And this one surprised me here in Florida because here's the Sunshine Skyway Bridge. Now, that doesn't mean that it's in danger of that it's going to collapse or anything. It just means that these are all major bridges that were built here before 1996. And anything before 1996 is suspect because now we don't know what protection is around it. And a lot of these massive ships that have been created over the years have gotten much, much bigger since the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s. I profiled this Sunshine Skyway Bridge last year during several of my videos on the MV Dali collision with the Francis Scott Key Bridge there in Baltimore. And you remember I used it as the gold standard because of the way they had all of those dolphins arranged and the way they have all of those rocks creating like a little beachhead to prevent ships from colliding into any of their pylons there. It'd be interesting to see what their calculations come out to be. And then as you go down here into the other states, you can see others like Louisiana, Maryland. Of course, now here on the Maryland, the Bay Bridge has not been done yet either. And that's the one that was real critical that they were talking about at the meeting, the Chesapeake City Bridge. And then in Massachusetts, oh no, there's my home state. I'm from Boston. And look at this, man. The Tobin Bridge in Boston, north and southbound. You got the Bourne Bridge and you got the Sagamore Bridge. So both the Bourne Bridge and the Sagamore Bridge are what connects Cape Cod over the canal there to the mainland. And if those bridges go down, oh man, I can't even imagine how bad life would be. So looking at the list here, it looks like the NTSB is giving Massachusetts a born ultimatum. And then, of course, in New Jersey, we got some big ones. You got the Newark Bay Bridge, you got the Verrazano. And then in New York, you got the Brooklyn Bridge. You have all of these. You got the George Washington Bridge here. So some high-profile bridges are potentially at risk here due to collision from a vessel. So unless they go ahead and run this AF calculation that the NTSB has been talking about, we could be in trouble, and we need to head this off now while we can. Because had the Maryland Department of Transportation done this with the Francis Scott Key Bridge, they surely would have identified that the Key Bridge fails this test, and they should have put more protection around those piers. And then rounding out the list are Pennsylvania here. Rhode Island and Texas has quite a few also. Washington and Wisconsin. So there you go. There's your list of 68 bridges that the NTSB is saying should have their calculations done to see if they are at risk for collapse after a collision with a ship. And now for an update on the Francis Scott Key Bridge rebuild. So yes, there is a new redesign, and I'm going to show you that. We'll go over it here. And thanks for putting up with us so far. I know we had a lot of information we had to give you before this here because there's been so much going on. But there is a redesign. They're in the early stages right now of the construction. And so let's take a look at what we've got so far. Okay, so the process to rebuild the Francis Scott Key Bridge actually began with this document here on July 19th, 2024, last summer. So this was 4 months after the MV Dali had collided with the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, resulting in its failure. And so right here it says they're issuing a request for proposal for general engineering consultant. Now, most people in the engineering world know that as GEC. And so they're looking for this general engineering consultant services to perform planning, engineering, construction management, and program support to reconstruct the collapsed Francis Scott Key Bridge. And then the other constraint here is that the contract will not exceed 5 years, and the maximum that they can spend on this is $75 million. So whatever entity wins this bid has to understand that they have to get all of this done with $75 million for their services. So then about a month later, on August 29th, MDTA announced that they have a winner for the contract, and then it went to, and I hope I pronounced this right, Kiewit Infrastructure Company. Okay, so they are the progressive design builder that will undertake the complete design and construction of the I-695 Francis Scott Key Bridge replacement. And it was confirmed over here on their website. Now, I want to show you what this progressive design means because it's a pretty cool way of doing accelerated bridge design. So in this case here, where we're looking at the Francis Scott Key redesign, a conventional bridge build will go like this. You'll have design, and then engineering takes place, and then permits after the engineering is done, and then you do the soil testing, and then you start construction. So you have a longer timeline. But with progressive design build, everybody is together at the same time. It's not a design entity, architecture firm, throws it over the wall to an engineering firm who then deals with somebody else who does the permits and all that. All of these people are acting together under one contract. And now here's the surprising part for you. Did you know you can actually start the construction phase of the project before the design's even done? How can you even possibly do that? This is how. As you can see, this submitted proposed design here has already been submitted, and so they're in the design phase right now, but you don't have to wait for everything else to start the soil testing because they have to do that anyway. So you start this now, and they can characterize all the different core samples of soil that they've taken from everywhere, from under the riverbed to on land to wherever else they need to get soil samples, and they'll know ahead of time what they can do. That way, the engineering and the construction here sort of takes place at the same time. They can start and design the piers first, and that way they can start building the piers and then engineer the rest of it from there. So a lot of this can kind of happen at the same time. So you can see how it shortens the timeline dramatically. Now, if you recall on my video that I made for you last year, about a year ago at this time, on the Florida, the FIU bridge collapse that killed several people. I showed you the hierarchy here, and it's very similar. So their GC builder was MCM, and then FIG Engineering did the design. Then they had this company, Louis Berger, who was supposed to be an independent peer review. And then you had this other company here, Bolton Perez, who was the CEI, the Construction Engineering Inspection. And they're usually supposed to be completely separate from these guys, not having any financial interest in it, because these guys are supposed to kind of look over their shoulder and find anything that's wrong. But it didn't seem to work out too well in this case here for FIU, because FIG engineers had too much power, I think, and not enough of any of these other players here spoke up in any of the meetings when the cracks were found in the concrete. Yeah, this is like the problem that NASA had with the Space Shuttle Challenger when it exploded, that not enough people spoke up ahead of time, people who had reservations about whether they should launch. So then in November 9th, 2024, the Coast Guard had posted this picture here. So this is the conceptual plans for the Coast Guard bridge permit that was being pulled at the time. So this gave us a more closer look at what's going on here. So it looks like a cable-stayed bridge design, as opposed to the continuous truss design of the former Francis Scott Key Bridge. And just for reference for you, I will throw in at no extra cost to you, this is the original schematic for the original Francis Scott Key Bridge. So now I want to take a close-up look at this and show you what's going on, because if you look carefully, they overlapped the old drawing of the old Francis Scott Key Bridge right here behind it. So you can see it there, that lighter gray color. So right off the bat, you can see the notable differences that the towers are going to be further apart. And you can see they want to widen the channel to 800 feet. I believe it was 700 feet before. Now, I don't know if that means that they're going to also go down underneath the bottom and dredge this up to reshape this to be wider as well. And then here they're showing the typical road section. So you're still going to have the same 2 lanes on both sides. So it's going to be a 4-lane road. And you're going to have the shoulder in the middle. And I guess, and the sidewalk here off to the side. And then this over here is the bird's eye view looking straight down on the bridge. Now here you can see they did an animation, and you're going to see they're comparing the old Francis Scott Key Bridge to the new bridge. So here's a head-on daylight view, and there you can see the transformation of how it's going to look. One thing's for sure, the 2 center piers there are going to be much taller, somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 feet from what I've read. And there's what it's going to look like at night. So it's a typical cable-stayed bridge. The Golden Gate Bridge is probably the most famous bridge that we've seen of this style. And then here's another sort of an angular view at the daytime. And then there's what the new bridge will look like. Somewhat of a wider channel as well. Although I don't know that 100 feet's going to buy us a whole lot. And there's, of course, what it's looking at night, too.
We'll begin other activities that include demo and the beginning of trestle work. We're out here taking surveys on the ground, underwater, and now we're taking surveys under the ground. That data is critical to getting the right kind of design. So the rigs behind us, these barges have drill rigs on them. Those folks are out there running the drill rigs, drilling down beneath the water. That gives us the information that tells us how to design our bridge foundations so we can hold up this new bridge. With this survey equipment, we basically trailer it in when it's on land. There's engine noises. There's a little bit of vibration hammer sometimes, depending on the rig. It's going to be isolated to the areas around the bridge here. We hope that there's not too much disturbance for the residents at this point.
Now let's take a look and compare some of the numbers between the 2 bridges here for our new Francis Scott Key Bridge. So of course we had previous was a steel arch continuous truss bridge, and it was 185 feet tall from the water to the road. And the new cable-stayed bridge will be 230 feet tall here. So that's going to be, so we're talking a difference of almost 50 feet here in vertical clearance. And next you have the total bridge length was approximately 1.7 miles before. It's going to be 2 miles next. And of course, the new bridge length will be 2 miles. And then previously, the bridge height, the max of the main truss right here, was 358 feet tall at the top. And now the new tower is 600 feet tall. And then when we look at this main span distance, before we had a distance of 1,200 feet going across to the piers between 17 and 18. And now that distance is going to be 400 feet wider. It's going to be 1,600 feet now. As I showed you a few minutes ago, the channel is being expanded from 700 feet wide to 800 feet wide. And then here we have the total length of the continuous truss span was 2,600 feet before, and the new bridge will have a total length of the cable-stayed main span will extend 3,300 feet. So it's pretty cool to see that at least they finally started. You can get all of these little early things done out of the way and make the project go along a lot quicker. Now, looking at the design, I do have a couple of points of contention, something that I think that maybe they could have done better. What do you think about this? Okay, so my only problem with this conceptual design for this bridge is this, really. You still have the issue of you have these islands that are there to protect these towers, and I'm not convinced that these islands are strong enough to. And then the other issue you have is what happens when a large ship comes up against one of these islands and the overhang from the bow still is able to reach over the island there and make contact with the tower. You're going to be right back in the exact same position again with the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapsing all over again. And of course, I know this is just an artist's rendition. They are not showing all of the dolphins that would have been placed here, but there should be rings and rings of dolphins around all of these here. And then one other issue that I have too is instead of going through all of this rigmarole that you see here with all of these towers and piers, why not put both of these towers on land? So have this tower be way over here on this side, and this tower be over here on this other side on land, and have the entire span go all the way across. So this makes the most sense to me. You put both of your main towers there on either side of the channel. That way, it doesn't matter because the ships can't even get to it at all. You don't even have to worry about the protection. You probably don't even have to run your vulnerability assessment either because it's a non-issue at this time. I know this can be done. Look at this massive cable-stayed bridge. This here is the Yavuz Sultan Selim Bridge over the Bosphorus Straits in northern Turkey. And look at this. Piers are on both sides there of the land. And look at this. See, it stretches 1.4 kilometers over the Bosphorus Straits. Pay close attention to this. I mean, look how this giant tanker here has no worries going under this bridge. Any ship can pass through not having a worry in the world, even if a wild storm blew them off course, because both of the towers are on land and you can't even possibly hit them. And of course, as the construction progresses, I'll give you updates from time to time. And I'm glad you stayed this far into the video. I know we had a lot of information to give out. And by the way, if you haven't seen that video that I mentioned earlier about the FIU bridge collapse, you can check on this video right here. And if you haven't seen any of my videos I've done on the Ocean Gate Titan submersible implosion, you can start with this one that I did a few weeks ago here, where the Coast Guard released that audio file just about a month ago. So thanks for tuning in today, folks, and we'll see all of you next one.